Welcome back, scholars. So, you have just completed your vocabulary and setting up your T chart for today's lesson. Scholars, as a reminder, your T chart should look like this. Our question: what was the first impression? What first impression did Cleopatra make on Mark Antony? We have Cleopatra's impression on Mark Antony, and then Cleopatra equals. So, scholars, we are only reading from one page today. As I read aloud, page 48, I want you to consider what happens in this section of the text. How does the author describe the ship that Cleopatra arrives on? How does the author describe Cleopatra? How does the author also describe others on board? So I want you to think through that as I am reading aloud. For those of us that have our books, we are on page 48. And again, I will be reading aloud. And I am starting with page 48. Passion and politics. Plato admits for sorts of flattery, but Cleopatra had 1,000. Plutarch. And we are starting at the very first paragraph. While Mark Antony was holding court at the marketplace in Tarsus and awaiting Cleopatra's arrival, word spread that the queen was approaching. As Cleopatra sailed on the Cydnus, Mark Antony's audience deserted him. Everyone rushed to the waterfront to view the magnificent pageantry of the queen's arrival. Onlookers watched in amazement as Cleopatra's gilded barge approached the harbor with its royal purple sails unfurled. Silver oars propelled the craft, each stroke keeping time to the music of flutes and harps. Cleopatra, dressed as the goddess Isis Pelagia, queen of the ocean, reclined on a couch under a canopy made of gold cloth. Young boys dressed as Greek gods stood on either side of the queen, using large fans to keep her cool. Her female crew consisted entirely of maid servants dressed as sea nymphs. A sweet fragrance from the perfumed sails filled the air as the barge pulled into port. So, scholars, we just read that. I want you now to consider what are some pieces of evidence that will help us answer what happens in this section of the text. How does the author describe Cleopatra as she arrives? How does the author describe the ship and the others on board? Let's give ourselves some think time. And guys, if you're wanting to go back and reread, we read the first two paragraphs on page 48. So, scholars, let us now answer. We're going to have 1 minute. We're writing in our evidence. What is the evidence that we have found in the text to help us make a claim on Cleopatra's impression? You have 1 minute. Let's go. 19 seconds. right. So, scholars, I just paraphrased a lot of evidence because there were a lot of things that the author used to describe Cleopatra's arrival. So, I wrote magnificent pageantry of her arrival, royal blue, silver oars, flutes, and harps. I wrote that she was dressed as a goddess, and I mentioned the perfume because there was a sweet scent that approached as her vessel approached. So here's my evidence. I now need to go in and I need to write a claim. So as we're writing the claim, remember we're thinking, how does the author describe Cleopatra, her appearance, her arrival? And we're going to make a claim. Cleopatra equals. We have 1 minute. Let's go. 16 seconds. Again, how was it arrival? Right? And scholars, I kept it simple, that it was an impressive arrival because of all of the extravagance that came with Cleopatra's arrival. Give you a few seconds to revise your notes if you need to. And scholars, we are going to move on. We're still on page 48, but in this page, in this next section, we are now considering, what did Mark Antony do when Cleopatra arrived, and what was her response? So we're looking for, what did Mark Antony do, and what was Cleopatra's response to Mark Antony? Okay, so we are reading the final paragraph on page 48. Again, we're reading the final paragraph on page 48. Remember, we're thinking, what did Mark Antony do when Cleopatra arrived, and how did Cleopatra respond? After her dramatic arrival, Cleopatra did not appear in the marketplace as expected. Mark Antony sent word to her, inviting her to join him for dinner. Cleopatra politely refused his offer, preferring not to go to ashore. She suggested that Mark Antony and his friends come dine with her on board her vessel instead. So, think time. What did Mark Antony do at Cleopatra's arrival? How did Cleopatra respond? I want us to think of some pieces of evidence that we can put down. And we have 1 minute. Let's write that piece of evidence. Let's go. So my piece of evidence was that Mark Anthony, and I did not write M.A., that way I know. So Mark Anthony invited her to the marketplace to dine with him. Cleo refused and invited him and his friends. I went back and added his friends so that we know that she just did not just invite him or only him. But Cleopatra refused and invited him and his friends aboard her ship to dine with her. So now we need to write a claim. And when we're writing that claim, I want you to think of this. I want you to create an inference. How might this affect Mark Anthony? So when Cleopatra refuses his offer to dine with him in the marketplace, but to come aboard her ship, and remember, this grand entrance has just occurred, but she's invited him to come aboard her ship and dine with her. I want you to use clues about Mark Anthony, what we already know, and what we read about Mark Anthony in chapter 6. I know that is a lot to consider, but you're thinking about when Cleopatra refused Mark Anthony's offer and instead invited him aboard her ship. How do you think that made Mark Anthony feel? Or what impression did that make on Mark Anthony about Cleopatra? Think it through. So now that we've had some thought time, I want us to take 1 minute and write our claim. It is okay to make that inference. That is what I am encouraging you to do. Make that inference in your claim so that when you respond in your independent practice today, you respond in a complete sentence with an inference. And guess what? You will already have it written down. So go ahead. We will take 1 minute. We are writing our claim. Remember, we're in the second box, Cleo equals. Our 1 minute has started. 27 seconds. All right. Go ahead, finish up your notes. I needed to make my tea chart a little larger because I had a lot to write. Okay, scholars. So I wrote that Mark Antony is likely to be intrigued by Cleopatra because Cleopatra refuses his invitation for dinner, but turns around and invites him and his friends aboard her lavish ship to have a dinner with her. So I feel like Mark Antony is a little intrigued by Cleopatra and at this moment. I'll give you time to revise your notes if you need to. I'll give you time to revise your notes if you need to. We're moving. So now that we've completed our T chart, we now know how Cleopatra's arrival was, how the author described her arrival, how the author described Cleopatra. And so, guys, we also see this interaction between Cleopatra and Mark Antony. It's almost like Mark Anthony invited Cleopatra on a one-on-one date. And Cleopatra was like, boy, bye. I am not going on a date with you. And so she, in return, says, but you and your friends can come on to my amazing boat and check it out and have dinner with me. So remember, as you're thinking about this, you are considering what was Mark Anthony's first impressions of Cleopatra. So, scholars, on your notes, you should have answered the question, what first impression did Cleopatra make on Mark Antony? I want to encourage you guys as you are writing your independent practice response today, be sure to write in a complete sentence. Guys, be sure to make an inference, and your inference today could be simple. How might the interaction between Mark Antony and Cleopatra affected Mark Antony? Scholars, it has been great today reading page 48 with you guys. Be sure to complete your independent practice. Be sure that you are responding in a complete sentence with an inference or a because statement. Remember, this is one way you can earn virtual kickboard points. See you guys tomorrow.